Well, hey there, degenerates, degenerati. I'm still alive. Welcome back to the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 295, featuring John Jones and Stipe Jiří Procházka and Alex Pereira, and Sergei Pavlovich and Tom Aspinall. What a disaster from a promotional standpoint. At least if you're like a casual UFC fan, which relative to most of the people that are betting on this sport, I would still consider myself a filthy casual. I didn't start watching again until last year, and here we are now. Life has been, I'm not going to say crazy, but you got to understand the incentive to do this show when the picks are still going out for free. I haven't missed a step on that, but yeah, the incentive to pair this with it, this show has been rough of late, given some of the quality of cards that we had, but I know I didn't even do one for UFC 294, so if you missed me, and I know there are some of you that did, some of you that even asked if I was doing all right, and I appreciate your concern, and I'm still here. We're working. Steered out of a losing streak last week with 12 units. One pick off of a clean sweep, got all the money lines correct, and that's what we love to see. But I know normally I would recap my errors, and I owe quite a few of them, at least half a dozen from the last three cards relative to the last time I had won before last weekend, which was all the way back in September. But the only mistake I made last week was the 1.5 under on Almeida Lewis, which, I mean, everybody made jokes going in that the fight doesn't go the distance was minus 10,000. I'm not sure what fight goes the distance closed at. I saw some people that were flaunting their tickets like, oh, I did it as a joke right before the fight started and look what happened. But realistically, nobody expected over 1.5, let alone the 25-minute mounting we saw. More like 21 minutes to be more precise, but I saw quite a few funny, noteworthy memes speaking on how that was like the worst case scenario of inviting one of your friends that like doesn't watch MMA over to watch what you think is going to be like either a high-level knockout or submission at heavyweight, and it just ends up being 25 minutes of dudes grinding on each other. Oh, it was, man. I remember like, all right, I was like, okay, after it went through one round, I was like, Almeida's not going to finish him, because I had seen the same kind of meticulous work rate against Shamil Abdurakhimov at UFC 283 earlier this year, which was also in Brazil, and Almeida just never got there, never really wanted to. Even when he had like the arm triangles, he didn't really want to swing his legs over. So I guess I have talked about it a little bit. I don't really know how much of a lesson you take out of that, because to be honest, I like, as a principle, I think that you have to put out a pick for every main event. You don't necessarily, at least for my betting strategy, if I'm like not confident in a main event pick, I'll usually only put it in like the moonshot parlay and just see what happens. But I never put out a stay away for a main event. I'll put out a stay away for just about any other fight, but a main event, a title fight, I cannot do that. I view it as a violation of the principles of betting, the self-principles, the morals of betting on MMA, if you will. So I will never put out a stay away for a main event. But I sure wanted to last week, because even though I had Almeida graded to win in the 500 range, I did not think it was worth it given the knockout threat Lewis has. And there was so much juice on that under I still thought I was going to hit, but I just could not bring myself to make that a super main leg of like the 3 or 4 leg parlays, which I believe all hit. So I was pretty happy with that. I got the 24th and 25th hits of those, by the way, since UFC 280 last year, by the way, those 3 and 4 leg parlays. So if you've been following for a very long time, since the beginning, you remember that my floor for parlays used to be 5 legs, and that didn't go so great. It's been a slow grind to get back up above that 1,500 unit threshold that is on the Twitter bio. So going to a more conservative amount of parlay legs, 3 to 4 in pursuit of a 10-unit return every time, that ended up being much more the correct way to go with respect to getting consistent long-term winnings. So I was quite happy with how last weekend went, especially coming off of 3 losing ones. And I think we've got about 5 cards left this year. So I think the lowest potential ROI I could have at this point is 32% for the year. That's assuming I lose 50 units the next week and a half. So hopefully that doesn't happen. But we'll see how UFC 295 goes. So there's 11 picks I've got on here, I believe, assuming no other fights have been canceled since the time that I'm recording this. And from what I can tell, yeah, it looks like I've got 11 fights I need to discuss, 10 picks. I'm going to try to keep these very brief. And another thing I'm going to do is I've usually been recording this podcast in like one, however long it takes, hour running shot, like 2 hours. I think it got to at one point. This is going to be, there's just so much to talk about here that I'm going to be recording in segments, like for each fight. I think it'll be easier for me editing it to get to timestamps as well. So if you notice a rhythm and flow, especially because you haven't listened to me for like a month, just feel free to leave me a comment. But I thank you very much for all your support. I couldn't have expected after barely just hitting my first year growth goal that I would hit my second year growth goal in what? 5 months. I mean, not even half a year. I appreciate the support from all of you so much. So thank you very much, and I'll try to do right by you the rest of the year and going forward, which will start with this fight between Jamal Emmers and Denis Buzukja. Now, if you're a real tape freak, then you will not merely use your ESPN Plus subscription to watch the available UFC fights of all these gentlemen, as I'm prone to, but you will cross-check their MMA records with their date and seasonal appearance on Dana White's Contender Series, and you will siphon that tape out of the ESPN search results and use it in your decision making. There's 2 fights of Buzukjas that have been on Contender Series that if you want to say that you've really appropriately taped this guy, that you should have doven into the weeds for. I know doven's not a word, but my point stands. You should have plunged into the weeds for. And I did, and you see improvements in terms of skills made, but what you don't see is an elevated ceiling. What you don't see is a development in an approach, which makes sense because Buzukja is still only 26 years old. And in most cases, in matchups for fighters, that's going to be, really something that other fighters have going for them, but relative to athleticism. But in this case, whatever presumed athleticism advantage Buzukja may have with the 8-year age gap with Emmers, it's clearly not transpired on the line. And part of that, I think, is because you saw Emmers in his last fight, the one round that he won outright against Jack Jenkins was when he really got his ground game going and was able to keep Jenkins on the floor for a very decent amount of the final round. Buzukja has an approach that really leans on that grinding and grappling when he's successful, because striking exchanges have not been nearly as successful for him. And you have to imagine that given Emmers was able to make it ambiguous with Jenkins in the last fight, in the eyes of many, Emmers was actually the one that won. You'll recall in my case, it was fortuitous that Jenkins did. I got a clean sweep at UFC on ABC 5, partly because of that decision. But it did come at the hands of Sal D'Amato and Chris Lee. So I recognize that, we all get some wins and some losses from the grace of the MMA gods or the judges or whatever other forces are at play with our money here, our investments. But my point about Emmers and Buzukja stands. Emmers showed enough in that performance against a guy like Jenkins that you have to imagine Buzukja wouldn't have a measure of performance based on how he performed against Melsik Bagdasaryan 3 years ago, or how he performed in his most recent fight with Sean Woodson, who offers a lot more length at this weight class than what's normal, and more than even Emmers does relative to what he would normally have as a considerable advantage. But Emmers has a well-rounded enough skill set that I think he'll be able to compete with Buzukja in the grappling and wrestling in a way that the two are going to be able to largely offset each other, where the majority of and the most important moments of the fight take place, which will likely be on the feet. I think it's very clear that Emmers has more polish and more seasoning at this level than what Buzukja does. So when this line first started, when I first looked at it this week, it was at 280, and I would have loved to have played Emmers inside of 200 in the 100 to 200 range. And when I was initially grading this fight, I was thinking he was probably going to be around 180, but that didn't end up being the case. After really diving in on the tape with Buzukja to make sure that this was a playable line for me, because I wanted it to be based on how I saw Emmers perform against Jenkins, I saw enough gaps in what Buzukja has relative to what we know Emmers has displayed at the UFC level that makes me think Buzukja is not going to have filled this in at a high enough level in a way that's going to let him beat Emmers in this fight. So I'm taking Jamal Emmers. It started at 280, and I wasn't great about that. It dropped to 250 during the week, and now he's evened out in the middle of those at like 265. So still very playable. I'd keep him, I would prefer him on the shallower side of 200, but, the way that I consider these things, as long as he's available to me inside of 300, I'm probably going to be okay with taking him here. The more that line gets out to 300, the less enthusiastic I get about making him a parlay leg, just because I think there's better spots on this card for the value. But Emmers should win this fight. And the only other thing that's really giving me a little bit of concern is if it does go to decision, Buzukja being the local New Yorker, how is that going to affect his judges, particularly coming off of a fight in which we saw Emmers, despite being a Miami native, fighting in Florida. Granted, it was in Jacksonville, UFC on ABC 5, but still, you'd think Florida does right by Florida, and he did not end up getting the grace from the judges, nor really the crowd, as you might expect, that would have probably made the difference for the two of them. So I'm still going to be taking Emmers. I'm going to be worried about if this fight goes to decision, which I think it probably will, if I'm being honest. But I think the finishing upside is clearly with Emmers here, even though Buzukja has never been finished himself. But this is quite a step up in competition for him, just relative to the success he's had. I know he's fought better guys than him that have hung around the UFC, like Bagdasaryan and like Woodson, but even the guy that Buzukja fought on Contender Series, not a high-level guy. I believe hasn't fought since that Contender Series appearance and was still able to take the first round away from Buzukja in a way where Buzukja had to come back the last two and didn't get a contract offer immediately because of it. So give me Jamal Emmers here. And depending on how weigh-ins go and the rest, we'll see about making him a parlay leg this week. The next fight is Joshua Van and Kevin Borjas. Oh, man. Contender Series was a roller coaster for me this year. I was way up in the background. I was, just kind of tailing some other high-level cappers, not really putting out any public plays of my own just because there's not really the data there. And got burned pretty hard on the back end after a really, really hot start. So I was feeling myself a lot from like August to September, and then riding the wave from June and July, obviously, from the UFC. But it's great. I don't even remember Borjas's fight. I think I might be confusing him with maybe other Peruvians that fought that season, just because I was so happy with the result later in the evening when Tom, I'm forgetting what his name is right now, but his name Tom, the guy from Australia, earned a UFC contract, and I could just tell based on like the measurables that that was going to be a pretty quick night at the office for that dude on his way to earning a contract, and did very, very well. And so I had to go back and retape that Borjas fight. And I was impressed with what I saw. You saw a lot of good three-piece combinations, but what you didn't see was the full MMA skill set. And you'll notice his submission record is 0-1. And you'll notice as soon as the fight hit the ground every time, he was always really eager to get it up, even though he had at some points, perhaps at positions where he could have manipulated the wizard he had more in order to, get the fight on the ground. But he was facing a guy whose strength was grappling over striking, and so it was correctly perceived by him in that sense to keep the fight away from there. But the fact that he had no submission wins prior to joining the UFC suggests there isn't really much of a UFC-level ground game there that another fighter might be able to take advantage of. It's unclear if Joshua Van at 22 years old is going to be the guy to do that. I believe they made the point in Van's last appearance that he had only started wrestling 9 months ago or 5 months ago or something. So Van has not even been wrestling for a full year yet. And so even though the potential is massive with this guy, I have to imagine that there's going to be better prices for him available in the future than this one. And Borjas showed enough technical ability in his own Contender Series appearance that it should make you nervous about potentially, especially if that fight goes the distance, trying to bet Van here as a 2-1 favorite. The other thing I'll say that's particular for this matchup is that both of these fighters are coming off of appearances that were the first time in each of their careers that they went to decision. Van got a split, albeit against a much more high-level opponent. Borjas got a unanimous decision in which he I don't want to say weaponized his cardio, because the other fighter didn't necessarily get tired, but it's hard to implement a three-wave approach of striking, grappling, and wrestling, especially when you're leading with the wrestling shots for 15 minutes, and Borjas was able to deploy more consistent cardio in that sense. Not saying Van didn't have great cardio to end the fight, but he clearly needed to show that, or figure some things out in the first round and then go win the last 10 minutes. And he did it on 2 out of 3 judges' scorecards, but not in a unanimous fashion the way Borjas did. So I'm not saying that there's, concerns about Van's cardio, but this is just a spot where you want to let Van prove himself and stay off it and not make the result your problem, particularly when there's so many other interesting lines on this card. I can see a fan, particularly someone that saw Van like on the come up, being like, oh, I have to get him here, or I've been waiting so long to be able to get him at this price, or just bet him at all. And I would just say for a fighter that, relatively recently turned 22 and has a reputation built on finishes, especially at flyweight, just let that play its course and you'll be able to take advantage of it over time. So don't bet this one. Van should win, but I won't be surprised if Borjas springs an upset and Van finally faces a little bit of adversity in the blossoming stage of his career. The next fight is John Castaneda and Kyung Ho Kang. I faded Ho Kang in his last fight against Quinones. I'm forgetting what event it was, but it was one of the only 2 picks that I missed on that card, and I only had it in the moonshot because I wasn't supremely confident and was a little worried that Quinones was front-running, and that proved to be correct. He also had a pretty vulnerable chin that hadn't really been exposed yet in the UFC, but just based on previous performances, it was still stunning to see Ho Kang drop him the way he did. I know that it says it was another submission victory for Ho Kang, but it was very much a club and sub in way of an emphatic knockdown for Ho Kang. One that makes you wonder what kind of resistance Castaneda would be able to put up from a shot like that himself. Castaneda has gotten knockdowns in each of his last 2 fights with head kicks, including the fight that he lost to Daniel Santos. So he is a very strong starter in a way that wouldn't surprise me if he ended up taking the first round from Ho Kang here. But Ho Kang has enough momentum going for him of late and has shown better management and resistance to damage over the last 15 years of his MMA career than what we've seen from Castaneda of late. I am kind of surprised that Castaneda is the favorite here, that this fight isn't really more of a pick'em at least. I think Ho Kang really turned a lot of heads with his last performance. And he was also the underdog when he was lined against Batgirl Dana a year ago. I didn't feel bold enough to pick him in that instance, but I did grade him to win. I went with the over 2.5 because I figured Dana trending down wasn't going to be able to be the first person to knock out Ho Kang in as many years as he hasn't been knocked out. I believe it's been 16. So I really do think that the more well-rounded, both of them have shown pretty well-rounded game in the UFC, but Castaneda has shown, I guess, a bit more of a tendency to fade. What I will say about Ho Kang is most of his decisions that he's won have been splits. So he's not necessarily an outright round winner late into fights. I think that he is probably a good strategist, though, the fact that he's been able to win as many as he has kind of proves that he's. I mean, so many of this of this sport is trying to just merely mitigate your opponent's strengths in a way that allow the own ways that you produce damage to shine more in the eyes of the judges. So I think that when you see the abundance of split decisions that Kang has on his record, it is a reflection of the fact that he's good at creating these ambiguous tie-ups. Perhaps, and I'm not sure what his underdog record is overall, but I'm sure it has to be very good. And it's certainly at least 2-0 in his most recent performances. So, given, I know he doesn't compete super often, but part of the reason that I faded him against Quinones was because he hadn't fought in a year. Given he has a first-round finish on his record this year, I'm very surprised that we're seeing him at underdog odds once again here. Odds, Jesus, I sound like fucking Yanni over here. Odds, the underdog odds. Oh, God, that's what watching Dana White's Contender Series does to your brain. Anyway, Kyung Kang is right now. I forget what the price was when I called. It was plus 122, and that line at this moment it's a little bit closer now. Kang is plus 110. Castaneda's 130. I bet Castaneda against I think it was Gafarov, and I gracefully Tagnoni gave that point deduction for the headbutt, which I thought was fair because I haven't seen anybody do a deliberate headbutt like that in like all the taping I've done, for going back. And I really only watch fights since like 2019 in terms of taping recent stuff, but I'm sure there are probably more examples prior to that, but what Gafarov did in that fight totally merited an instant point reduction or deduction. So good on Tagnoni for doing that. Castaneda didn't even end up needing it in the grand scheme of things, but I'm still glad that he got it. He did get a 29-27 unanimous, and I made him a parlay leg for that event, I believe. So I felt good about the value he was at. He was at the same price for that fight against Gafarov, who just got guillotined by Nurmagomedov, that that he is for this fight against Kang. So the same value that was there earlier this year against a much lower level opponent, no way it is the same as what it is going into this fight, given the momentum Kang has paired with the UFC experience. So I think Kang has to be the side here. He is my most confident underdog on this card. Of all the ones that I have, I would say that he's the most confident just of any of the plus odds money lines. So give me Kyung Kang. Lines come down a bit since earlier this week. I will be curious to see if we get something closer to a pick'em as the week draws on. The next fight is Jared Gordon and Mark O. Madsen. Madsen was one of the very first, I think within the first 100 people I taped last year. Perhaps not. I believe it was close because he fought right after UFC Columbus. But he was, I remember watching his tape relative to my analysis and thinking he was going to fight Vic Pichel. And I remember very early on thinking, even though I had a great deal of success with betting underdogs, I felt pretty confident about Madsen beating Pichel by decision, just based on how much I put into it. And I remember watching the fight next to someone at the bar because it was a pay-per-view that they were fighting on. It was when Volk fought Zombie. I'm forgetting what the number was, but I think it was 273. I could be, and I could have it wrong. It's escaping me right now, but I remember just kind of laying out what I thought was going to happen, and then it's exactly what it did. And it was an early confidence moment for me in terms of knowing what I was talking about to the sport relative to speaking on it to other people. It was impressed, but Madsen, was vindicating for me, and then I was optimistic about potentially betting him as an underdog against Grant Dawson, and ultimately opted to hedge on the rounds in that fight. And then when Dawson missed weight, I decided to cancel, and that was the right reason, or that was the right move, but not for that reason, obviously. Dawson went on to get knocked out by Bobby Green, and he did squeeze in a quick win over Ismagulov between that. However, Madsen has not competed since that loss to Grant Dawson. For reference, how long ago that was Grant Dawson's last fight with James Krause, or James Krause's gym. So that is the last time we saw Madsen in the octagon, and he ain't getting younger, folks. He's 39 years old, and I think that this is a very, very rare. It's my goodness. So, okay, I don't normally cut myself off like that because I like doing the market thing at the end. But when I put Gordon out at minus 175 earlier this week, I felt very good about that price. Gordon has since ballooned out to minus 220, and that's devastating for me because I wanted to make Gordon a parlay leg, and now I think I'm just going to have to put him in the mood because I don't have that level of confidence in him. At this range, I would much rather play Emmers for a little bit more juice than Jared Gordon at this price. But I still think he should win this fight. And honestly, like, if this fight, maybe if it wasn't happening in New York, I would say take Madsen at this price, but because this fight is so heavily favored to go to decision, the over 2.5 rounds is minus 280. Like, Gordon will be better on the feet, but isn't a finisher at all for what you think it would take to put away Madsen for only the second time in his MMA career. But Madsen, to his credit, I mean, we did see Bobby Green drop Grant Dawson pretty bad, so there's still a lot of questions to be left about what Dawson can really supply striking-wise. But Madsen, before that fight, I was driving home from Chipotle when that fight was happening, so I didn't get to watch the first 2 rounds of it until I just taped it this week. But Madsen, he didn't really get credited for a knockdown in the first that he maybe should have gotten, and he did it by throwing like a 4-punch combination even though he didn't land all 4, but I had never seen him throw 4 shots in succession like that in the UFC in the time I had taped him last year. So he has made strides with his striking late into his career in a way where if you wonder if he hadn't gone back to the well for wrestling when he was 28 years old, if he had stayed the course with just strictly MMA or gotten into the sport earlier, how much better he could have been. But I don't think this is going to be like a Jared Cannonier case where the guy is suddenly setting a significant strike record for the weight class when he's 39 years old. This is a former Olympic wrestler, and he deserves credit for that, but it gets increasingly harder to implement that game plan as you get older, and Gordon has enough of a well-rounded MMA game that I think he's just going to have a little bit more left and will have enough support from the crowd in the bigger moments that he can get at least 2 rounds and get a 29-28 here. It's dangerous being very confident in a unanimous 29-28, but they happen all the time in this sport, and the history is written by the winners in a way where a fighter wins a 29-28, and we really just focus on the 2 rounds that they won rather than what that fighter that won that 1 round did well and ended up losing. I could definitely see Madsen stealing the first round here, but Gordon really just staying the course and establishing himself and the crowd coming into the fight with him over the last 10 minutes as we see Madsen kind of start to fade because he's just supplying his success on a formula that gets harder and harder to implement as you get older in this sport. And he's also been away for a year at this point. And Gordon has much, I won't say much less ring rust. He hasn't fought since the head clash with Bobby Green, which happened, I believe, something like 7 months ago at this point, which is crazy to think about. But Gordon also fought Paddy Pimblett within the last year sooner than Madsen has the last, although he fought him in December of 2022. So it's, that's like a month difference. You still see how Gordon, with the prep for the Bobby Green fight and, actually getting in the cage and everything, the ring rust is something that could factor on Madsen here. I have to take Gordon. But it sucks to see that he's fallen into the 200 range because now I'll just say you got to put him in the moonshot, but leave it alone otherwise. The next fight is Nazim Sadykhov and Viacheslav Borshchev. Okay. Apparently, people have been saying, this is a striker-grappler matchup. And when I say the striking is closer than people are saying, you can still acknowledge the fact that the edge in that case goes to Borshchev. But we should also recognize that Borshchev, his success has not necessarily come against the highest level competition. Sadykhov, by contrast, I know that there's many, many people that are salty about the way his fight with Evan Elder ended, and I think a lot of people use that to discredit him. He got dropped in the first round, but he fought back and ended up getting a finish. I don't think that he won the second round on anybody's scorecards, but the fight was, I think, at least ambiguous enough before he got dropped in that first round. And then he earned back, I think, some respect with the way in the McKinney fight people said, he's, going to get, if McKinney runs through him in the first minute, then it's done. But even though he ended up giving up his back to McKinney in a very bad position, he still took only like 6 blows to the head in that fight, and in the second round just completely drowned him. A lot of people complain about the fact that he got away with a fence grab for some reason in that fight when almost the winner of almost every fight gets away with grabbing the fence in this day and age. They'll never ever call it, even when it's super egregious. They may just give a warning the first time. It's so rare to see a fighter actually get penalized for grabbing the fence, which I think is one of the reasons why people made a cow about it in the Leon Edwards-Kamaru Usman rematch. But Sadykhov, it still has a path to victory here that Borshchev has already shown he's not really great with dealing with. Part of the reason that we're still trying to figure out the Mark Dikisi, what is he going to do going into any fight game plan wise, is because that was one of his performance against Borshchev. And then after that against Damir Hazelvich, I believe his name was, some guy from Denmark, they were saying, he's a lay and pray guy now exclusively, which he was in those 2 fights. All he did was really just get takedowns and rack up control time, which can work, but against people that have more well-rounded game that are able to stand up, it in a lot of cases ends up just doing more harm than good when you could have been throwing strikes, especially if your opponent has that striking skill set. But we don't have any reason to believe that Borshchev has the get-up game to make that an issue for Sadykhov when he chooses to deploy it. Borshchev isn't necessarily a guy that has demonstrated he's got one punch lights out power. He does have very powerful body shots, and he's accurate with them, and his kick game is obviously on point. He got 3 knockdowns against Maheshate, but again, it's Maheshate. Sadykhov weathered a storm from a more dangerous first-round fighter in McKinney, and given Sadykhov he doesn't have a long history of going the distance, but he does have a lot of fights with success in the 3rd round, and the one fight that he did have go to the judges, he did win by unanimous decision. So I'm very, very optimistic about Sadykhov in this spot and this price. I'm very glad it's held at 130. In light of Jared Gordon, that line kind of floating away, I think Sadykhov very much has to be a leg for me at this week at this price and the confidence I have him at. The path to victory here is too obvious, and as long as his defense holds up, which I think it should, because the one thing that I would say that he has the edge in striking wise is he's just better at keeping his head out of danger a little bit better than Borshchev is, and that is in spite of the fact that that's in spite of the fact that we saw Sadykhov give up that knockdown to Evan Elder. One of the reasons that he was able to beat McKinney was because he weathered the early storm by keeping his head safe, even when he gave up back triangle. So when this fight goes to the ground, it's completely in Sadykhov's world, and I think people are viewing this a little bit too much of a grappler versus striker mindset versus which guy is within that matchup, which guy is going to be better at mitigating or giving back some resistance to the other guy's strengths. And we've seen Sadykhov able to give at least a little bit more back to Borshchev, where Borshchev has not shown the takedown defense nor the resiliency on the ground to return to his feet to inspire faith that he's going to be able to overcome a guy like Sadykhov. I don't believe Borshchev has ever been finished, so it's probably likely this one goes to decision if Sadykhov is winning it by keeping it on the floor, but it's very possible that Sadykhov ends up handing Borshchev his first submission loss here. I don't think it's out of the question. So give me Nazim Sadykhov, and we'll see what happens, because I think this has been one of the more volatile fights on Twitter this week heading into UFC 295. So we'll see if I'm proven correct. The next fight is Mateusz Rebecki and Roosevelt Roberts. I was a huge fan of Rebecki against Loic Royzabov, even before Royzabov missed weight. Royzabov, that dude lost. But I was so hopeful that we were going to get a fair price here, just because Roberts fought very recently to a split decision, and I thought honestly fought the better fight and probably should have won against Austin Hubbard on The Ultimate Fighter, and just did not get the gracious look his way, which was a shame, because that performance, like across Contender Series and the UFC, like all those combined, that was his 10th like all-around UFC appearance. Just crazy to think about. And this is going to be his 11th in what's like his third reclamation not on favorable terms, but the price here is so gross that you cannot touch this at all for any reason. I mean, you got to understand, like, it's so rare to get. It's one thing to get it's interesting. I've been looking into the height, reach, like, myth section of Fightnomics, the book by Reed Fightnomics, if you're familiar with him on Twitter. But one of the things that they illustrate in that book is that height isn't actually an advantage unless it corresponds with reach. So what you should be more often looking for is just what the reach is relative to whatever height may be. And, it becomes truly significant after like 6 inches or more. And with height, it's important, but it doesn't necessarily illustrate the same elevated edge, but it is still very important. The thing where it gets weird is that as it really, really starts to get to anomalous territory, other fighters so rarely see opponents that much taller than them in terms of sheer height that they often are perplexed by an opponent that they haven't been able to train against that is like an unreplicated challenge that they're facing relative to what their skills available may be. I bring that up because Roberts in this fight has a 7-inch height advantage and a 7-inch reach advantage. I have never seen that across any weight class. 7 inches for height might be the most I've seen in discrepancy between two fighters. And it's not like they have a non-comparable reach. Like, it's very much favoring Roberts. Now, Roberts' offensive accuracy isn't as good as Rebecki. Like, Rebecki owns all the striking stats, and he's going to have the edge and power. And he is clearly going to be the superior ground guy. But the tools are there for Roberts to manage the exchanges in a way that is favorable to him and also keep Rebecki out of true landing range relative to takedowns or power shots. Rebecki should clearly win this fight, and it's possible that Roberts just ends up getting tired from the short notice, having to go on short notice, and Rebecki ends up submitting him in the late first or early second. But again, this is 150 more points of value than what Jailton Almeida closed for last week. You cannot bet Rebecki at 650 here. It's just irresponsible. So this is a no pick from me. Rebecki should win, but do not bet this. Absolutely not. The next fight is Steve Erceg and Alessandro Costa. Everybody's all over Erceg now all of a sudden after one good UFC showing in which he still, on at least two judges' scorecards, dropped the first round to David Dobrik. I know on in the case of that fight on a previous RAXPOD episode, on a non-recorded segment, I previously said, I like David Dvorak a lot, and I think you can probably take him even at whatever price he's at, but I'm obviously not going to include that just because Erceg's never fought in the UFC, and as a rule, I don't bet strictly to avoid situations like this where an unknown comes out and wins like that. I shouldn't call him an unknown because I guess there's a lot of people saying like, oh, he, did really well in this Australian promotion and that's why I bet him and that I knew he was going to do it and now he's going to crush in the UFC. But like, is he? Is he though? I mean, he might, but I don't think that he should be owning a 200 price tag here against a guy that has also fought good competition at flyweight at the UFC level, but has paired that with, at least one finish win. It isn't a case where like Erceg, where he got a unanimous decision, but it was off of winning the last 10 minutes, and he did do it on short notice. But, I mean, a lot of people were saying that, David Dvorak was like starting to fall off a little bit. And I think that he hadn't fought since the Manel Kape fight. And that fight certainly took a lot out of him. And prior to that, he was coming off of the loss to Mateusz Nicolau, where he was also favored in that fight. So he, it illustrates how being favored against those two, or he wasn't favored against Manel Kape, but people did think he was going to get finished, and he survived to a decision, but he took a lot of damage in that fight where you wonder if he came back the same guy and he got upset by Erceg. But that was a case where Erceg was able to capitalize. Costa's not in the same position of career trajectory. Almost said trajectory. But I think that Costa, he showed a few tendencies when he made what I think might have been a short notice debut of his own against Amir Albazi. I mean, I'll be worried if this fight is predominantly striking and Costa freezes up kind of again if he, for some reason, experiences early difficulty establishing range or figuring out how he really wants to approach the fight. Both fighters have a similar reach, but Erceg has 4 inches of height, which some people may look at that as, oh, he's going to be able to just lay on him and implement his game plan the way he wants. But Costa's got 91% takedown defense. So if he's able to keep this fight standing and Erceg is having to stand up with his chin 4 inches higher in the air to be located by Costa with the similar reach that they have, that could get very interesting even for a guy that's never been finished, that did take a couple of decent shots in his last fight against Dvorak, but Dvorak's not a one-punch lights-out hitter himself. So these guys have the same amount of trips going the distance in their career, 4, and a similar amount of final round success correspondingly. Erceg obviously has the better momentum, but I just don't think he's proven enough here where he should be favored over a guy like Costa. Costa has these guys both have one-punch lights-out power for flyweight, which is crazy. It's more of a rarity than you would think at that weight class, but both of these guys have it. And I think Costa's being disrespected still based off of that performance he had almost a year ago now, when he really should be getting a little bit more respect than that at this stage. So give me Alessandro Costa. Not my most confident underdog of the night, but certainly one of, if not the most valuable, given he was much closer, I think, to like 160 when I called him. Yes, 160. Now is sitting at plus 170, and Erceg is ballooned out to minus 200. So, hey, keep dumping it on, Ercegers. The next fight is Pat Sabatini and Diego Lopes. This fight's been pretty close all week. Sabatini was about 120 when I put the pick out, and it's been bet down a little bit, and it is basically a pick 'em at this point. Lopes, I made him a leg in his last fight when he was fighting, I believe it was Gavin Tucker, but it was important to recognize that Gavin Tucker was coming off an extremely significant amount of ring rust in that case relative to, I think Lopes had like the perfect amount of time to recover from his decision against Evloev. So Lopes is obviously in the stage where he's improving, but he's fighting a guy here who is in a similar stage of his career. Sabatini's in the prime of his career. Lopes is like preparing to enter the prime of his. So they're in similar spots. And even though I think you can expect Lopes to eventually become a better striker if maybe he isn't already right now, Sabatini has enough UFC experience relative to Lopes at this point that even though I don't think I hesitate to say it's going to be as impressive of a performance as the one Evloev had. Second time I've done that against Lopes, but it was also on short notice, and he did almost get a submission at the end of the fight that Evloev had to endure. I don't think it's out of the question that he gets an opportunity against Sabatini as well, but Sabatini just employs his game plan so similarly to Evloev that, given you've seen the formula for position over submission work not only in many other cases but also in the recent success against Lopes, you just wonder if he's going to become a little bit too content to chase submissions and Sabatini's going to be able to capitalize on it. And you also wonder how big the gap in the striking really is between these two, because Lopes, again, he got a great finish, but it was on the strength of, a finishing technique that traditionally requires you to sacrifice position. In this case, he couldn't have rolled it any better, but he was also getting to do that against someone who was much less sharp than he was relative to recent professional competition. So I know people have made point of the fact that Lopes is, I think, Alexa Grasso's Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu coach. He's obviously good at what he does in that department, but if things are still rounding into form relative to MMA, I think the guy who previously got lauded for his ground game coming in but is still kind of rounding out striking and other gaps in his skills, the guy that's proven he can do that a little bit more at this level is the one that should be favored in this spot and has been despite the optimism on Lopes. So I don't want to make Sabatini a leg, but I might have to. I know that there's going to be chin concern just relative to him getting kicked by Damon Jackson a year ago, but I think that there's even similar reason to be concerned about Lopes's chin, and that Sabatini ultimately is going to be the guy that is better at controlling the ground in a way that results in damage, even if Lopes is able to get a flurry of submission attempts. And it's possible his relentless pursuit of his own submissions opens him up for a mistake where Sabatini's able to capitalize, because we've even seen Sabatini have more of a finishing instinct than what Evloev has shown despite his amount of control he's racked up. So give me Pat Sabatini to win a decision. I don't think a submission is out of the question, however. The next fight is Benoit Saint-Denis and Matt Frevola. or as the fans will be referring to him in the crowd during this fight, Steamroller. Which is, I don't want to say it's the main reason I'm picking him, but it is a hinging factor in what is, I think, an otherwise extremely close fight that is not lined as such. If this fight were happening in France, I would say Benoit Saint-Denis would be pretty clearly the favorite. I don't want to say clearly the favorite, but I would favor him a lot more. If it was neutral, I would favor him in similar pick'em range. But I think that this, you hesitate to call him a front runner, but the truth remains the guy has not won any decisions in his MMA career yet, and you're going to take a 200 price tag on him. I know you probably did it against Moises and felt very good about it. I took Moises at plus odds, and I ate that one, but I still made profit on UFC Paris. That was my only underdog play for that fight, or for that card, but I digress. Benoit Saint-Denis has made more improvements as an MMA fighter during his UFC run than I would say probably most of the roster in the last 2 years. He went from being a guy that had like no top control game to really learning how to move positions effectively and flow into mount, which you saw him be able to do against Moises. He did a good job with like holding the back. His ground and pound wasn't super great in those positions when he got to mount, but he did a good job when he, just kind of wore on Saint-Denis when Saint-Denis wore on Moises with his back taken, pressing him against the cage, and then he did that in the first round a bit, and then again in the second round, that was the position he ended up finishing him in with the strikes. And it was also nice to see that when the ref started to encourage Moises to defend himself, Saint-Denis responded to that by going harder in an effort to secure the finish, and was able to do so. So he also like way more sophisticated combinations than what he had coming in. So I do give him a bit of credit and grain of salt that loss to Zaleski dos Santos. He's made improvements since then in a way where it would be interesting to see that rematch, but you also need to take into account that the reputation that fight has is more of, that ref glad he was never in an MMA event again, versus, or in the UFC again at least, versus that was Benoit Saint-Denis' debut, and Zaleski dos Santos, still the highest level fighter he's faced at this point, I believe, beat him. And now he comes up against what I would consider probably his greatest challenge to date in Frevola, because beyond 2 flash knockouts and another, I'm forgetting what his third loss was, but I believe it was a finish. But the point is, Frevola has beaten a higher level of competition and standard than any of what Saint-Denis has faced at this point. And I think it's not probably wise to think that Frevola is just going to knock out Saint-Denis here. It is worth mentioning for Drew Dober having this big reputation as not only one of the hardest hitters in the UFC, but also one of the sturdiest chins. I mean, for Frevola to drop him in the way that he did, I did think Dober kind of got the raw end of a decision, but the way that he went down was aesthetically very bad. And there was at least one ground strike, I think, where Herb Dean just did not want to invite anything worse. So you can kind of understand why it was stopped, but we saw Frevola put Izaitar out bad enough where Izaitar didn't even remember what happened, even as he went back to his corner. So Frevola's one-punch lights-out power is very much established in a way that Saint-Denis, for all the improvements he's made, that guy doesn't have that lights-out power that Frevola does. I think Frevola can win 2 rounds with that power against a guy that has not fought to a decision in victorious fashion in his MMA career yet. The longer this fight goes, the more it's going to be better for Frevola. He's got to survive the early wave, and he's going to have to survive the second wind that Saint-Denis has demonstrated he can show. But if Frevola is hurting him that whole time, and it's 1-1 going into the final round, I think you have to feel good about the fighter with the power advantage that's going to have the home crowd rooting for him, enthusiastically chanting, "Steamroller," all the way down the stretch. So at these odds, I think you've really got to take Matt Frevola. So give me Matt Frevola to win by, I will say, decision. I'll say Saint-Denis' record of not getting finished holds up, even though if his fight against Zaleski dos Santos had been stopped, as everyone criticizing the ref in that fight seems to be advocating for, then the rep on Benoit Saint-Denis' chin might be a little bit different. But to his credit, he is trained by French special forces to resist torture and pain. So we'll see how much that factors into his ability to resist Frevola womps on Saturday. The next fight is Tom Aspinall and Sergei Pavlovich. So I very, very much have Aspinall graded strongly to win here. I just think like the pattern of my analysis, one of the founding principles is that in a mixed martial arts fight, the guy that is demonstrated at a UFC level, the more well-rounded skill set, is usually the one that is going to win. The guy that has demonstrated all of the tools that you want in striking, both power and volume, but also defensive discipline. And then the tools that go with that, ranging from kicks to sophisticated combos. But then also the ground game to complement that, both in terms of commitment to top control and wrestling positions, as well as the ability to complement those with submissions and striking. Just the fight can go anywhere over the course of 15 minutes, and you generally just want to have your side be with the guy that has demonstrated more of the full skill set, given one misstep by either side can cause the fight to go to another location where new tools are required to be successful. That is true for all weight classes, but there are special rules for heavyweight. Because when both guys are capable of nuclear wompage, some of that kind of gets thrown out the window, strictly from a betting perspective. I figured Aspinall was going to be my favorite here, but the fact that I have him graded so heavily to win, like as a disclaimer, of all the fights I graded this week, I have him graded like the most favorably out of everybody's matchup, which I think is pretty alarming and I don't necessarily trust. Just because I also had Curtis Blades graded to beat Pavlovich, and I figured that in that case the under was going to be the better way to go than with Blades, but I didn't trust my instinct on that enough. And even though we just saw last week how betting on 1.5 unders on a heavyweight fight can go against you, the reality is that weight class has a higher finish rate than all the other ones for a reason. And in this case, with this fight, I look at where the under is, and I just think, how are people giving this much value on it? I know it's crazy to say a fight that it's in the 200 range is in value relative to like juice, but I mean, we've seen Pavlovich unders have been free money since I started taping last year at UFC London. And Aspinall unders, I couldn't. Aspinall, the under in his fight with Volkov at UFC London last year in March was like plus 140. I mean, it's unbelievable that like there's still the kind of thought like, oh, that these guys aren't gonna like trade and do damage to each other. I mean, Aspinall said in the press conference today that he thinks the funny similarity between him and Pavlovich is that they both have enormously hittable heads. Aspinall compared his own head to a sniper's dream, and that's in a fight that he's going into with a 6-inch reach disadvantage. So there's absolutely the case for Pavlovich to just get a whomp here, and you wonder what Aspinall's damage tolerance is relative to the injury he suffered a year ago, just strictly neurologically speaking. And I could be just totally thinking on conjecture there. I'm not saying the guy isn't tough, but when your system like is responsible for keeping you intact when you've absorbed a shocking like blow to your chin like what Pavlovich is going to be trying to land, you just wonder if like relative to what happened last year, if that shock of the system is going to respond well to what Pavlovich is able to offer. But we know Aspinall can drop people just as well too. And we've seen Pavlovich lose by KO, and it came in a way where we haven't really seen him dominated since, but we also recognize that Blades didn't necessarily lead with a wrestling approach when he fought Pavlovich in a way that if he had been able to take him down, it would have been interesting to see what happened in the first round. But we're here now. And even though I do expect Tom Aspinall to become UFC champion, and that setting up a rather interesting not only potential title shot for Curtis Blades if he's able to rebound from his loss to Pavlovich. Obviously, a win over Jailton Almeida would have helped in that regard. But it will just be... I still think that we're going to see Aspinall win inside the first half of the fight. And I hope John Jones takes that fight, because if Jones beats Stipe, I mean, people will be much more impressed with a title unification winning performance over Aspinall than I think they would be with anything he can do to Miocic, even if he finishes him in the first round. So that would be a cool fight to see in London, right? Aspinall versus Jones. You think John Jones would take that, or would he want to keep it over here? Maybe somewhere neutral. Either way, give me the under 1.5 in the heavyweight title fight. And now we've come to the main event. Alex Pereira and Jiří Procházka. We haven't seen Jiří in the octagon for 17 months. 17 months. Think about the year Pereira has had. And then think about the fact that we haven't seen Jiří Procházka for 17 months. I don't think that there's any dispute that Procházka is the more well-rounded MMA guy here, but we have to consider who is more fresh in terms of implementing their skills to success. And I think we also have to consider the fact that Procházka, even though his unorthodox style creates opportunities that many fighters otherwise wouldn't have access to, it also leaves him open for damage in ways that are not going to be conducive to long-term success in this sport. He was getting hit by every single opponent he faced, including Reyes, but he ultimately just landed something more spectacular than them. He was losing the fight with Glover Teixeira until Teixeira committed a crucial mistake in the waning moments, and Jiří was able to capitalize. But he was on his way to losing that fight, and then how much more different is the perception he has and the entire conversation around that belt in the last year if those 30 seconds at the end of round 5 just play out a little differently. Pereira, there's undoubtedly chin concerns, but at the same time, he's still been finished less times overall in his career than Procházka has. And so you wonder now, not killing himself to make 185 with 20. I mean, you don't want to say there's going to be 20 extra pounds of weight because, obviously he rehydrates like a madman. I think they said he could be fighting at like 218 or something after he makes 185, which is totally insane. But I mean, if he's able to go in with even more weight off of that at light heavyweight now, you have to think that's going to help his chin, especially if he hasn't lost any of his speed. Then that's only going to assist his defense in terms of not getting hit while still having greater resistance to whatever does ultimately end up getting through. So I think Procházka is going to hit some unorthodox shots, but I expect Pereira, after really trying to go at him with a lot of leg kicks early, just kind of using the first round to download, and then looking at his strategy and what adjustments he can make striking-wise. And I think that by the time we see Jiří try to change the fight up and bring it to the ground, it's ultimately too late, and he's not able to change the fight up in a way that may be visibly successful for him before Pereira is able to either find a finish or win 3 rounds after dropping the first. So I expect Jiří to win the first round, but I expect Pereira to come on and eventually take this down the stretch as the fighter with a bit more experience in that regard. Procházka, his 5-round fight history, just based on that Teixeira fight, that's not something you can necessarily feel encouraged by. Although I think it bears pointing out that these two fighters have 3 decisions between them in their MMA careers, which is kind of crazy. So betting a decision here is bold. But I think if you're going to ask me between these two, who's going to knock out the other one, you'd have to feel good about it being Pereira, just given the ring rust factor is almost certainly going to be there for Procházka. So give me Alex Pereira to win by, I will say, round 3 knockout, and to take his place at the light heavyweight throne after starting the year on the middleweight throne and potentially setting up an avenue for Izzy Pereira 3. And that's going to do it for the UFC 295 MMA RAXPOD. Thank you very much for tuning in, folks. This is definitely faster than I think I've done almost all of these breakdowns, at least on a consistent across, trying to keep it below 10 minutes standpoint. I know the first 2 I did were a little bit maybe longer, but I think most of these were pretty much in the ballpark of 5 to 7 minutes, and that's what I would like to keep it at going forward. So I hope that was enough meat for you all. And thank you very much once again for tuning in. I think I'll be back for UFC 296. It's going to be tough for me to do the production on all of this by myself, writing solo. It'd be different if I had a partner in crime, but I don't know if I want to branch out the Rax network yet, so to speak. But, it would, in time, there will be more incentive to have more content. But like I said, this is just a beta. And I think that for the purpose of owning my skills as a podcaster, which I do already do elsewhere, it's going to be better for me to just only worry about doing this once a month as opposed to every week, or at least just every time there's a pay-per-view. So I hope you'll all understand this is just the beta, and there will be more content to come in the future from MMA Rax. But, in due time. We still got to finish out the year in front of us. But I'll be back for UFC 296 and looking forward to it, and we'll have parlays out tomorrow. I am flying to Ohio tomorrow for big football weekend related to that podcast elsewhere duties I said. So I'm not gonna be super in a position to. I'm going to a college football game while UFC 295 is gonna be happening for the most part. I might be able to get out and watch the main event or the title fights, but I'm gonna largely miss the early prelims, and I'll almost certainly entirely miss the prelims. The stadium where I'm going, the Wi-Fi doesn't have the best rep, and between that and cell interference, it's going to be hard to, tweet anything out or even just stream the fights. So probably not going to find anything out until way later, just as a disclaimer. But I'm letting y'all know that if you listen to the end here. But I will have the parlays out per usual. So thank you very much for tuning in, and look forward to speaking to y'all about the fights again soon. And yeah, that's about it. Take care, folks.